highlighted what the inherent rights are, inherent sovereignty is, and the inherent title to lands and resources that we are responsible for collectively. The people, the governments, and the nations. When we look at the recognition that's there now, and here now, and in many cases being rejected, I don't understand why. Because when we talk about all those areas that I've highlighted for you, they're all recognized today. And here's how. I told you how they're reserved, recognized, confirmed, and guaranteed by treaty making and the treaties. And the treaties are international treaties. And I'll discuss with you in another video how you deal with the status of international treaties and the national powers of treaty making. But I also highlighted for you how they're recognized by the UN Declaration that recognizes everything we wanted recognized historically, today, and for the future. And along with that, there's the comprehensive legal political framework that governs Crown Indian nations' relations today. And how is that framework governed? It's governed by our inherent sovereignty, and today by the Crown's assumed sovereignty. That's a term that's used by the Supreme Court in identifying the sovereignty of Canada, basically related to them making the treaties with us, because there's conditions to their sovereignty and their title to lands and resources and so on. But that framework is also governed by our inherent sovereignty, our inherent title to lands and resources, our inherent rights by sector. And they're governed by the international treaties in our territory. Treaties 1 to 11 are now recognized as international treaties by the UN by recognizing Treaty 6 as an international treaty. Now, the framework is also governed by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And there's a lot of misinterpretation about that proclamation. I met with Judge Dixon in dealing with the patriation of the Constitution, showed him the charts I had, and he agreed with them. And I included the Royal Proclamation of 1763 having to have continued recognition in any amendments or structuring of the Constitution Act of Canada. And he said, look, here's my interpretation of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's royal instructions to our government by the British government and the Crown. And it's a Bill of Rights recognizing everything that you have, recognizing your sovereignty, recognizing your powers of governing, your powers of treaty making, recognizing all those inherent rights you have identified here, recognizing all your inherent sovereignty and title to lands and resources. That's our Bill of Rights, respecting the recognition under the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So that now is given legal effect under the Constitution Act of Canada, Section 25(2). But you see, we don't go there either to deal with that recognition, because there's different interpretations based on the doctrine of discovery, colonial system. Well, we have our interpretation too. Now, when you look at that framework and how it's governed, it includes now the Constitution Act of 1982. Section 35(1) recognizes everything, our sovereignty, national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, recognizes our inherent rights, like I defined and identified, recognizes our treaties and treaty rights, but it does more than that. It increases the federal powers and jurisdiction over 9124 powers and jurisdiction. And Section 35 now provides for the federal government to provide for legislation and laws that identify clearly their legal, fiscal, trust, and jurisdictional obligations, respecting how they deal with the recognition and implementation of inherent rights and title, inherent rights by sector, the recognition of our sovereignty, and our governments of our nations. And when we look at that process of the Section 35, it basically identifies all the powers under Section 92 of the BNA Act for provincial powers in education, child welfare, health, and so on. Now, federal powers under Section 35, 1, and having to have the federal government occupy a field with their own laws and jurisdiction in every sector for our inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights implementation and enforcement. The Auditor General told Canada, the federal government, a few years ago, when they still had Indian Affairs and First Nations Indigenous Health Services, they said, your policies don't have any legislative base. But you see, that's not isolated to just those areas. In many, many areas, their policies have no legislative base. The Indian Act is all based on the colonial policies of assimilation, integration, civilization, Christianization, and liquidation. Now, when we look at the recognition under Section 35, people don't understand it. Even the deputies and ADMs and a lot of the cabinet ministers federally, and certainly not provincially. So there's a need for major education. But getting back to the recognition of our inherent sovereignty, our inherent rights by sector, inherent rights to land and resources, that's all recognized in the Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35, and Section 25(2). Of course, our own lawyers, many of them, are disputing that. Well, they weren't there when I was part of implementing that and negotiating that. I was in London, England by myself, dealing with that. And they used to call it an empty box. And the late John Tate called me one day on a Sunday afternoon. He said, Premier Lougheed wants to add the word existing in Section 35. I said, go ahead, I got no problem. What's your problem? Oh, nothing, he said, I just want to let you know that Premier Lougheed wants to add the word existing in Section 35. And I said, well, you know my position, John. He said, yes, you have inherent sovereignty, you have inherent rights by sector, you have inherent rights to lands and resources, you have treaties and treaty rights. I agree with you, he said. And that'll still continue, even if we add the word existing. So it doesn't really matter to me if you want to do it, do it. But you're going to recognize Section 35 in terms of the patriation of the Constitution. It's not an empty box, it's a full box. He said, yes, I agree with you, it's a full box. And they'll find out later. And that's what's happening today. Now, Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Justice Minister federally, I went with her here in Saskatoon with Chief Fox and other chiefs, including my own chief, Kel Sanderson. And I told her, look, no government in Canada has ever recognized our inherent rights. Yet that's who you are, and that's who I am. And I listed them, and I gave her the document, the hard copy on what they are. Went through them, and I said, now it's time for Canada and the federal government and Parliament to recognize our inherent rights. And she took note of it. And she went back and she developed 10 general principles. Again, it rejected by AFN, FSIN, but no alternatives. But those 10 principles are pretty major. And what did she do? Even though they were rejected, she went back and drafted 22 justice directives. And for implementing those justice directives that provides for implementing those 10 principles, she identified how the foundation between the Crown and Indian nations is based on our inherent rights. The first recognition by a government of Canada of inherent rights formally, lawfully, and politically. Now, when we look at the Organization of American States Declaration, the UN Declaration, everything we're talking about having to be recognized is recognized now. Why are we reacting? What's your problem for those who are reacting and rejecting? But more important, if you're going to reject it, what is your alternative? Why aren't we moving ahead in implementing everything under our government jurisdiction and law and occupying the field with our own jurisdiction and law in every sector, but not laws that apply just on reserve, within reserve boundaries by ban. Your laws and jurisdiction apply nationally, regionally, internationally. And the colonial system has really taken a toll on us to believe that our jurisdiction, our laws and governments of our nations apply just to one band and one reserve. Those are collective powers and jurisdiction you have to assert your powers and jurisdiction, not just by community, but collectively, regionally, nationally, internationally. And going back again to the Convention Act of the Federation of Nations, it provides for the recognition of all of that. So in moving ahead with your Constitution or your Convention, it's critical that all the things that I highlighted at the start is what needs to be identified in your mandate for your governing powers for implementation and enforcement. Now I'll be providing a hard copy of the rights that I identified by category in terms of your rights that you have that are collective rights for political rights, social rights, economic rights, spiritual and cultural rights. And there'll be a hard copy like this identifying what they are and what impacts on them. And then there'll be another chart identifying what we need to do to implement them. So that hard copy will be available along with other charts that I'll be providing. And there's no reason why we can't move ahead collectively today. I said unity is a word that is being used today, but there is no unity. And if you want unity, we should be working collectively on what I just highlighted for you and with you on our inherent sovereignty, national powers of governing, internal, external, international powers. And when we look at that, we also have those national powers of treaty making. So we have, like I told you, all those inherent rights by sector, and we have all the inherent rights entitled to lands and resources. So our challenge collectively is one of how we come together on constructing unique and special laws under our government jurisdiction and law And we need to do that now. We can't wait. And the code of silence that I spoke of impacts on all the information I just gave you. Because we used to have the elders tell us about these things. But a lot of that has been lost. But it's pretty encouraging to see what's going on today. A few years ago, one of the chiefs, a male chief, said, "How do we get out of this mess?" I said, "It's happening in front of you." I said, political development, I was told by one elder, 100 years, it takes 100 years of change in political development. And it's like 1 year in your lifetime. I spent 63 years in this work, and I understand now what the elder was talking about. But I told the chief, "It's happening in front of you." He said, "What?" "Well, our women are stepping up to take their traditional roles and powers of governing." I said, "We now have several women chiefs and council members, and there's going to be more. But," I said, "the colonial policies took away their powers and terminated their powers of governing. What do we do to provide for building that capacity back with respect to the powers of the women in their governing capacity?" I said, "The only thing that we need to be concerned with is there'll be some women that do power tripping at the expense of our people. And some of that is happening today, and we don't need that. Many of our men and women don't know how to use power. So they are inserting their powers on our own people. So we need to learn how to implement the powers of governing in a more constructive, positive, and productive way." So when we look at that whole area then of the implementation of inherent sovereignty, inherent rights by sector, inherent title to lands and resources, those are collective responsibilities and duties that we have. And that about ends my presentation on inherent rights. Thank you.